Good afternoon. This is the sixth and last video on ecology, and it's talking about the nitrogen cycle mainly, and then only a few other concepts, and then we will finish the unit, inshallah. In the nitrogen cycle, we will see how nitrogen, like carbon, like water, are recycled between air, mainly because nitrogen is a major component of air. Nitrogen constitutes about 78% or 79%. So although when we inhale air, nitrogen does not diffuse through the alveolar wall and usually does not reach the blood. It's just important because it is an inert gas, and therefore its presence is important besides oxygen in order to prevent the high or to control the high reactivity of oxygen, and therefore to prevent excessive oxidation and the occurrence of fires, for example, on the surface of Earth. So it is present mainly in air, and it is present in the soil, and the recycling will occur between air and the soil. And the bacteria play a very important role in the process of nitrogen cycling. And for example, if we start by nitrogen in the air or in the atmosphere, we will find that there are bacteria on the roots of plants that are present in masses, and masses of bacteria that we call bacterial nodules or root nodules, because they are present on the roots and specifically in leguminous plants. And these are nitrogen fixing bacteria, meaning that they are capable of taking the inorganic nitrogen from air, and that is in the gaseous form, and convert it into an organic form that is not gaseous, and in the form of ammonium salts. So in nitrogen fixation, bacteria of bacterial nodules take nitrogen from the atmospheric air and convert it into ammonium and ammonium ion, and therefore we can find ammonium salts in the soil, and then the ammonium salts throughout nitrifying bacteria will convert the ammonium salts or the ammonium radical into nitrates, and then the nitrates in the soil can be decomposed by denitrifying bacteria that do the opposite and break down the nitrates into nitrogen again in the atmosphere. I have to apologize because I said to convert inorganic nitrogen into organic nitrogen. Yes, that's true. We convert inorganic, or the bacteria convert inorganic nitrogen into organic nitrogen, but ammonium or the ammonium ion is not organic because it does not contain carbon. We obtain the organic compounds from nitrogen only when this ammonium ion and when the nitrites and nitrates enter in the structure of proteins. At that moment only we can say that we have an organic molecule, because proteins, as you know, contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and in addition to nitrogen. So the nitrogen that leguminous plants, for example, form, like in beans, in lentils, this nitrogen comes essentially from the inorganic nitrogen of earth, of air, and then this inorganic nitrogen is fixed by the nitrogen fixing bacteria into ammonium and the ammonium ions, and then into nitrites, and then into nitrates, and nitrites and nitrates can be converted or can be used to convert the carbon skeleton of glucose into a protein. So any plant that can form protein essentially synthesizes glucose via photosynthesis, and then the CHO skeleton of glucose, when receiving a nitrogen ion, when receiving a nitrogen atom, can be converted later on into a protein. So we have talked about we have talked about the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the roots of leguminous plants, in the root nodules. We have also talked about nitrifying bacteria, and then we finally talked about the denitrifying bacteria. This process of assimilation by the plants means incorporation of the nitrates into proteins, and this is what I was talking about. So when we assimilate nitrogen into the plant, this means that the nitrogen that has been converted into ammonium and then into nitrites and then into nitrates will be used to form amino acids and proteins in plants and animals. And then we have the detritivores that whether they are fungi or whether they are fungi or they are decomposer bacteria that will decompose the proteins again into ammonium ion. So very little nitrogen enters the ecosystems directly from the air. Most of the nitrogen enters from the air into the ecosystems through bacterial processes, meaning that nitrogen is present in the air, in the air of any ecosystem, but in order for this nitrogen to be incorporated into the soil or to be assimilated by the plants to be used to form proteins, there should be some bacterial processes that act. So we have the nitrogen fixing bacteria, as we said, that live in the nodules of the roots of leguminous plants that convert free nitrogen into ammonium ion. And then we have the nitrifying bacteria that convert the ammonium ion into nitrites and then into nitrates. This is important. So we have the ammonium ion converted into nitrites, and then nitrites are converted into nitrates, whereas the denitrifying bacteria exactly do the opposite. So up till now, we have seen 3 types of bacteria, and you can add the 4th type of bacteria, which are the decomposer bacteria or the detritivores. Of course, we said that the main reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere, but nitrogen is also found in the soil, and we said that it is present in the soil in the form of ammonium salts, or it can be found as nitrites, or it can be found as nitrates. And maybe now you understand why fertilizers are nitrite fertilizers or nitrate fertilizers are famous, because they should be added to the soil whenever you want to cultivate a leguminous plant. Of course, nitrogen is assimilated in plant and animal biomasses because it enters in the formation of proteins. And we said before that the acetyl radical that results from the breakdown of glucose when receiving nitrogen can form amino acids. It's also present in groundwater, but to a small extent, because nitrogen can dissolve in water, but it's not highly soluble in water. Now, of course, humans and the relationship with the biosphere is not a very healthy relationship, because humans have made Earth an uninhabitable place, because the human population is increasing exponentially. This is number one. And this tremendous increase of the population is, of course, using natural resources. But the problem is not really in the population and the use of natural resources, because Earth is supposed to have enough resources, especially that why do we think that Earth has sufficient resources? Because there are many resources that are recyclable. So the recyclable. So the fact that the carbon is recyclable, water is recyclable, nitrogen is recyclable. So even if we have a big number of living organisms that consume a certain resource like nitrogen or carbon, at the end of the day, those organisms will die and will be decomposed, and everything will be returned to Earth. But the process is that we waste the natural resources and we pollute the air and water. So the major problem is not really in the big size of the population as much as it is in the wasting of natural resources and the pollution of air and water. And now we're going to talk about a very important process, which is the process of eutrophication of lakes. What is the process of eutrophication of lakes? In order to understand it, we will look at the diagram first. So here, for example, if we have algae on the surface of water, and these algae are photosynthesizing, then the presence of the sunlight will help these algae to bloom and to reproduce and to increase in number. Furthermore, so we have here sunlight. This is one factor. So this helps the algae to photosynthesize and to get nutrition for themselves and therefore to reproduce. But there is also this drainage water, or that runoff that comes from the drainage water, because this drainage water has fertilizers dissolved in it. Why? Because villagers or fertilizers, man in general, uses fertilizers, adds fertilizers to the soil. So when you irrigate the soil, when you add water to the soil, the surplus water will be washed away through the drainage channels and will wash away all the fertilizers with it. So these algae will bloom not only because they are photosynthesizing and they have plenty of sunlight, but also because of the excessive nutrients that are coming from the fertilizers and that are flushed from the land into drainage water, flushed because the soil is inclined or flushed because of rainwater. So the algae will bloom, oxygen will be depleted. And because they photosynthesize intensively. And when algae bloom, they will cover this surface of the water, and therefore they will prevent sunlight from reaching the plants that are present at the bottom. So because they prevent sunlight, then these plants will die. And when they die, the decomposers will work on them, and we will still have plenty of nutrient material that results from decomposition. And since the decomposers are anaerobes, then there will be a real problem because of depletion of oxygen. And therefore, more and more oxygen will be depleted, and oxygen level will reach a certain point where no life is impossible, and this will result in death of fish. We forgot to give a comment on number 2. When those fertilizers are drained into water, of course, into the lake water, of course, this will help the growth of the plants and the other weeds. Okay. So at the end of the day, what would happen is that we will have more and more sedimentation at the bottom of the lake, and finally, the water will disappear, as we'll be reading on the slide. So humans disrupted the freshwater ecosystems, causing a process called eutrophication. What's the ultimate result of eutrophication? That we will have death of all aquatic organisms and depletion of oxygen, gradual increase of the sediment and disappearance of the water in the lake. So number 1, runoff from sewage and manure from pasture increase nutrients in the lakes and cause excessive growth or blooming of algae and other plants. So if the lake is already shallow, the shallow areas of the lake will be choked with weeds, because there will be, why are we using the term choked in particular? Because there is accumulation of those weeds, and therefore there is a diminution of space, but there will also be diminution of oxygen. So we have diminution of space and diminution of oxygen. So those large populations of photosynthetic organisms, like the algae, for example, will die. And this will result in two negative results. The first one is this organic material will accumulate at the bottom, so sedimentation increases. We will have increased sedimentation. So the depth of the lake will be reduced because the soil is rising every now and then because of increased sedimentation. And number two, the detritivores, the decomposer bacteria or the fungi that are heterotrophic will consume the detritus or the dead algae and will decompose the plants and animals. And since they are aerobes, then they will use up oxygen. And of course, lower oxygen will result in death of the fish and death of other organisms. And therefore, the whole process is going towards death of all organisms in the lake, and at the same time, increased sedimentation, disappearance of water, disappearance of oxygen, and this is the overall resultant of eutrophication. So, for example, the Potomac River, the eutrophication, for example, of the Potomac River, the river is still there, but it's becoming more and more shallow. And we can see the bright green water, how bright green colored it is because of the accumulation or the bloom of cyanobacteria. Here, in the previous example, I gave you the photosynthetic organism that was blooming and that was increasing in size and that was hiding the sun rays, was the algae. But here we have cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria have this bluish green color, or sometimes they might be, actually they are not bright green, they are bluish green, but actually the cyanobacteria are photosynthetic and they are autotrophic. So there are some factors that helped eutrophication. So the first factor at first was the abundance of sunlight. So at first we have abundance of sunlight and abundance of fertilizers, abundance of sunlight and abundance of fertilizers. This is the beginning. So at the beginning, so A is the beginning, abundance of sunlight and abundance of fertilizers, but we end up by having blocked sunlight that cannot reach the bottom of the lake, plus death of, insufficient oxygen, plus insufficient oxygen. This is the second stage. And then at the end of the day, we have stage C, which is death of the organisms and disappearance of the water. So at the beginning, everything was blooming. In stage A, everything was blooming. We had plenty of sunlight and abundance of fertilizers or nutrients. And then by the blooming of the algae resulted in blocking of the sunlight, and insufficient oxygen because of the decomposers, and then death of more organisms because we already had death of organisms here, and this is what caused insufficiency of oxygen. So here we would have death of more organisms like fish, for example, and disappearance of the water in the lake. Of course, you all have heard about acidic rain whenever you have an industrial area and fumes that arise containing, for example, nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, and at the same time you have water that causes the atmosphere to be humid. Then when this water vapor condenses in the form of clouds, then the clouds become heavy and there is a precipitation, then the precipitated rain will be acidic rain because it will not be pure water, although what really evaporates is only pure water. For example, if you have seawater that evaporates, it's only the water that evaporates and salt stays in the sea. So usually when you have condensation of water in the form of clouds, the precipitation or the precipitated water and the rainfall will only be pure water. But in this case, you would have acidic rain, because if sulfur dioxide dissolves in water, at the end of the day, it will form sulfuric acid, and nitric oxide will form nitric acid, and the trees would be killed by the acidic rain. We talked previously about biological magnification. You know that unfortunately, there are toxins that have been introduced and that have reached the food chain. For example, like what? For example, you know that many cattle species and chicken species are given antibiotics to prevent diseases, are given hormones in order to accelerate the growth. And then through biological magnification and the more and more concentration of these toxins in the food chain, since man is present at a higher trophic level, and sometimes it is the top of the food chain, then there would be accumulation of such toxins that might be carcinogens causing cancer, or teratogens causing congenital anomalies and birth defects. They will accumulate, and we saw this before. We compared the number of parts per million at the top of the chain and at the bottom of the chain. And this is, of course, so whenever you give even a small concentration of antibiotics or hormones to an organism that is present at the bottom of the food chain, you should be expecting that at the top of the food chain, you would have more and more intensification, magnification of the concentration of that toxin. And this is the example of the DDT that we saw before. Now we're going to talk about global warming and introducing new species. And this would be, or those would be the two last topics. So, of course, you know that we have something called the greenhouse effect. When you have pollution, a polluted environment where we have lots of cars and lots of vehicles, and we have the excessive fuel combustion. You all know that fuel combustion results in the release of carbon dioxide as well as water vapor from the combustion because there is water that evaporates. Carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere will form like a layer above the atmosphere that will retain much of the light and the heat that come from that comes to the earth from the sun. So here we have the sun, and this is the light that comes from the sun. So first of all, it will minimize the light that reaches the surface of the earth. But furthermore, what happens actually is that there will be retention of heat around the earth, and this is what we call the greenhouse effect. And if the greenhouse effect did not occur, the average temperature on the surface of earth would be much, much colder than what we see nowadays. So, for example, during summer, the average temperature, if it is now in certain areas, like Egypt, for example, if it is, for example, 38, in the past, at the same time of the year, it might have been, for example, 32. This is what we mean by global warming. And of course, it has been recorded that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased over the last 150 years because of the Industrial Revolution and because of all the development that occurred on the surface of Earth. Okay, so this increase in the average temperature on the surface of the Earth is called global warming, and it causes disastrous effects on the surface of Earth because it results in melting of the polar ice caps, and therefore the levels of the seas and oceans rises because all what was, or a great part of what was supposed to be ice is now water, and therefore there are more and more floods on the surface of Earth, and maybe some coastal cities might be sunken or might be totally flooded and covered by water because of melting of the ice caps. Furthermore, there are living organisms like the coral reefs, for example, that are greatly affected by global warming. And to the extent that this difference in the average temperature on the surface of water affects the deposition of calcium salts, sorry, of their skeletons. So they have now difficulty, the coral reefs have difficulty building up their skeleton because this is a biochemical process, including biochemical reactions that require an optimum temperature for the enzyme. So if the temperature is not optimum, then this would be affected. And why it is important for the skeletons to be built, of course, to protect the coral reefs. Furthermore, when the water is too warm, the coral reefs will expel the algae from them. And there are algae that live in the tissues of this is extremely interesting, that live in the tissues of the coral reefs. When they are expelled, this is called coral bleaching, okay? And a bleached coral reef is not dead, but the problem is that this represents more and more stress for the coral reef. So it is more and more endangered, resulting in greater mortality. So the presence of the algae in the tissues of the coral reefs supports the life of the coral reef. And with this warmer water and with the expelling of the coral reef outside, then this would not only result in change in the color, the bright colors of the coral reefs, but it also affects their viability. Furthermore, there is increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but carbon dioxide dissolves in water very well, and therefore the water content of carbon dioxide, or the carbon dioxide content actually of the water, will increase. What's the problem with increasing carbon dioxide in water? When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, as you know, it will form carbonic acid, and this will result in acidification of the water, and this makes life hard for oysters and sea urchins, just because of increased acidification of the water in the oceans, and this would definitely affect the pH around them, and therefore affect enzymatic function, and therefore affect their viability. Okay, one of the major, of course, as you know, problems of global warming is the depletion of the ozone layer. It's not a direct result of global warming, but it is a direct result of the accumulation of the gases that cause global warming. For example, the accumulation of chlorofluorocarbons, and these are chemicals that are used in fridges, for example, and in aerosols. These chlorofluorocarbons have resulted in the depletion of ozone, of the ozone layer. They reacted with ozone and converted it. So it's no more ozone, but so we have a place in the atmosphere or in the ozone layer. So if this is Earth, for example, and this is the ozone layer that protects where we have ozone around the Earth's atmosphere. So there will be an area where there is no more ozone, and through that area we could have harmful, for example, ultraviolet rays that reach the Earth, and that would be responsible for melanoma, for example, or cancer skin. Here, of course, these are examples of the living organisms. We are talking about the oysters, the sea urchins, the zebra mussels. And of course, top right, you can see how the coral reefs have been bleached. Here, of course, you have you have diagrams or curves that are related to global warming. So since 1880 to 2000, we have had a rise in the sea level. Why? This is because of melting of ice, and melting of ice is because of global warming. So snow loss, you can see that there is snow loss is associated with a level in, with a rise in, a concomitant rise in the sea level and a concomitant rise in the global air temperature. So the three graphs are related. Snow is diminishing, sea level is rising, and global air temperature is rising. And at last, we have the last concept in ecology, which is introducing a new species to an environment. Sometimes human beings have decided to introduce or to move a species into an environment, and this usually resulted in grave consequences. And we have two famous examples. The first one is the killer honeybee. The killer honeybee is a very aggressive subspecies of honeybee, and it was brought to Brazil in 1956 to breed a variety of bee in order to produce more honey than the Italian honeybee. So when man introduced the killer honeybee in Brazil in 1956, the aim was to breed it with another variety of bees in order to get offspring that would produce more honey. And accidentally, those African honeybees escaped and spread throughout the Americas. And since those honeybees might result in death of human beings, so 10 people were killed by these bees in the United States. Of course, it's very serious and risky to introduce a new species, even if it is for the purpose of production of more honey. But what would be the benefit of introducing a species that produces more honey if that species can be toxic to man? The second example is that of the zebra mussel. It's a fingernail-sized mollusk. It's a very small mollusk that is, we have just seen it on the screen. The zebra mussel is at the bottom to the left. It is a very small nail-sized mollusk that is native to Asia, and it was discovered in a lake. And no one in another area. Okay, so no one knows how the mussel got introduced into that lake, but most probably it was accidentally carried by a ship that came from a fresh water port in Europe to the Great Lakes. So if that mussel that is the problem with the newly introduced species, not only in the previous example, the newly introduced species was accidentally toxic. And for this is one problem of newly introduced species. But the second major problem of newly introduced species that they might not have enemies, natural enemies in the place. And this is extremely important. That's why whenever you remove a species from an environment, it's also dangerous because you are disturbing the balance. That species you want to remove from a particular environment would cause imbalance. Maybe that species you want to remove was useful to protect you from something else because it was predating that something else, you see? So here the problem is that when we introduce, for example, mussels to a new environment, because they have never been there before, so they might have no natural enemies or predators in that environment. So they will grow exponentially to the extent that they might obstruct or clog the water. And this is what actually occurred. Those mussels grew exponentially to the extent that they even clogged the water pipes, and this caused millions of dollars to be wasted in order to try to change those pipes or to clean them up. And finally, we're going to talk about pesticides. Usually we use pesticides in order to get rid of pests. And this is important because pests are pathogens or parasites that destroy the plants. But now we have found that pesticides are dangerous because those pesticides we spray on the plants are going to be accumulated through the process of biological magnification from the plants where we spray them to the top of the food chain, whether the top of the food chain is a human being or, for example, it is a hog or whatever third or fourth consumer. So scientists thought that it would be much better to use biological control, meaning that if I want to get rid of a certain parasite or plant pathogen, for example, instead of spraying pesticides to kill that particular pest, I will use a natural enemy to get rid of it. So pesticides, as you know, are chemicals that they are toxins actually because they kill living organisms that kill undesirable organisms. So you have the pesticides might be insecticides to kill the insects, or even herbicides. Herbicides are considered pesticides because the word pesticide actually, although it is called pesticide, although a pest is a harmful organism, usually a pathogen that causes a disease, and side means killer. But here, the definition is broader. It includes all undesirable organisms. So it includes chemicals that kill insects and even chemicals that kill the undesired herbs that live in between the trunks of the trees, and those that kill fungi, those that kill mice and rats. All these are considered pesticides. Of course, pesticides essentially were used in order to avoid death of the living organisms, especially the plants, and therefore increase the availability of food, or to kill rodents, for example, that were responsible for transmission of a plague from the rats to human beings, or to kill female Anopheles mosquitoes that were responsible for spreading malaria. But of course, the drawbacks is through biological magnification, as we said. So mainly through biological magnification, those pesticides caused cancer in man, not only through magnification, but also through the flourishing and blooming of the resistant strains. So we had two major problems with the use of pesticides. We had the process of, or the problem of biological magnification, and the problem of the development of resistant strains. So nowadays we are using biological control as an alternative to the widespread use of pesticides. And we have 4 examples here of biological control. The first one is crop rotation, meaning that if you have a certain crop that is usually affected by a certain pest, then we will change the crop. We will stop cultivating that crop for a while and cultivate another crop. So the pest would find that its natural host is no more there, so the pest will migrate to another place or die. We said before that if a living organism cannot be adapted to a certain environment, then it either dies or it migrates to another place. Number 2, to introduce a natural enemy of the pest. So if you have a certain pest, just use a natural enemy for this pest in order, for example, a bird or whatever, in order to get rid of that pest. But of course, you have to make sure that by introducing this species that is a natural enemy for the pest, you are not disturbing the ecological balance by introducing an invasive species, as we said, that doesn't have a natural enemy in the place and therefore would flourish and itself be a problem in the future. We can also use plant toxins instead of synthetic ones. It has been found that plant toxins are less harmful than the synthetic ones like DDT. Of course, we talked about plant toxins before when we talked about milkweed. And we can also use insect birth control. For example, we can expose the male insects to radiation. And in such a case, this would result in sterile males that cannot like have viable offspring. And I think that that was the last thing. Thank you so much, guys. It was a hectic unit, although it's not very long, but at last we have finished ecology and we've finished our AP curriculum. My best wishes for you to get excellent grades on your official and your school final test, inshallah. Thank you, guys. Bye.